Sarah Martinez had been serving tables at the military mess hall for 3 months, her small frame and quiet demeanor making her nearly invisible among the loud, boisterous soldiers who filled the dining area each evening. She moved with practiced efficiency, balancing heavy trays and dodging playful shoves from recruits who saw her as nothing more than civilian staff. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard-issue apron over plain clothes that gave no hint of her true identity. The evening shift was always the busiest, with hungry soldiers streaming in after long training sessions. Sarah had learned to navigate the chaos with ease. Her movements precise and economical. She knew which tables got rowdy, which soldiers were respectful, and which ones she needed to watch carefully. Tonight felt different, though. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air that made her senses sharpen instinctively. Corporal Jake Morrison and his 2 buddies, Private Collins and Private Reed, had been drinking before dinner. They weren't supposed to, but the 3 had found a way to sneak alcohol into their barracks and were feeling bold and reckless. Morrison was known for his aggressive attitude and his belief that might made right. At 6'2" with broad shoulders and hands like ham hocks, he intimidated most people he encountered. Collins was smaller but meaner, with a cruel streak that emerged whenever he had backup. Reed just followed along, too weak-willed to stand up to his friends but eager to be part of their group. As Sarah approached their table with dinner trays, Morrison's eyes followed her movements with predatory interest. He had been watching her for weeks, noting how she always seemed to slip away whenever he tried to engage her in conversation. Her polite but distant responses to his attempts at flirtation had begun to irritate him. Tonight, emboldened by alcohol and encouraged by his friends, he decided to make his move more forcefully. The mess hall was beginning to empty as the dinner hour wound down. Kitchen staff were starting their cleanup routines, and most soldiers had returned to their quarters or recreation areas. Only a handful of tables remained occupied, scattered throughout the large dining room. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, and the sound of clattering dishes echoed off the concrete walls. Sarah set down the last tray and began collecting empty plates from nearby tables, working her way systematically through her section. She was aware of Morrison's table but continued her duties professionally, hoping they would finish their meal and leave without incident. Her training had taught her to assess threats constantly, and something about their body language and the way they kept glancing at her triggered warning signals in her mind. When she finally approached their table to clear their plates, Morrison grabbed her wrist. His grip was firm and possessive, his fingers wrapping completely around her slender arm. The gesture was meant to intimidate, to demonstrate his physical superiority and her vulnerability. Collins and Reed exchanged knowing looks, their grins revealing their anticipation of whatever their leader had planned. "Not so fast, sweetheart," Morrison said, his voice carrying across the nearly empty dining room. "We need to have ourselves a little conversation." His tone was casual, but his eyes held a dangerous glint that Sarah recognized immediately. She had seen that look before, in much more dangerous circumstances than a military dining facility. The few remaining soldiers in the mess hall pretended not to notice the confrontation. Some were genuinely oblivious, focused on their own conversations and meals. Others sensed the brewing trouble but chose not to get involved, either out of fear of Morrison's reputation or simple unwillingness to intervene in what they assumed was harmless harassment. Sarah's expression remained calm and neutral, showing no sign of the calculations running through her mind. She assessed the room layout, noted the positions of potential witnesses, and evaluated her options. Her voice was steady and professional when she responded, giving no indication of her growing readiness for whatever was about to unfold. "I need to finish my shift," she said simply, attempting to pull her arm free. Morrison's grip tightened, and she felt the pressure of his fingers digging into her skin. Collins leaned back in his chair with a smug expression, clearly enjoying the show. Reed fidgeted nervously but said nothing, caught between excitement and unease about what his friends were planning. The situation was escalating quickly, and Sarah knew that her carefully maintained cover was about to be tested in ways she hadn't anticipated when she accepted this assignment. Morrison stood up slowly, using his height advantage to loom over Sarah while maintaining his grip on her wrist. His friends flanked him on either side, creating a wall of intimidation that blocked her path to the kitchen and the relative safety of the staff areas. The positioning was deliberate. They had done this before, cornering women who couldn't fight back and had nowhere to run. "See, here's the thing," Morrison continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that only she could hear. "You've been playing hard to get for weeks now, acting all high and mighty like you're too good for us. But you're just a waitress, and we're soldiers. Time, you learned some respect." His breath smelled of alcohol and aggression, and his free hand gestured dismissively at her uniform apron. Collins moved closer, his movements casual but calculated to cut off any escape route toward the main exit. He was grinning now, feeding off the power dynamic and his friend's dominance display. "Yeah, we just want to have a friendly conversation," he added with mock innocence. "Maybe teach you some manners while we're at it." His eyes traveled up and down her body in a way that made his intentions crystal clear. Reed positioned himself behind her, completing the triangle that trapped her between the three soldiers. He was nervous but trying to hide it, desperate to prove himself to his more confident friends. The formation was designed to overwhelm through sheer physical presence, to make her feel helpless and compliant. They had used this tactic successfully before on other women who worked on the base. Sarah's mind remained ice-cold, despite the dangerous situation developing around her. She noted each man's position, their body language, their apparent skill levels. Morrison was strong but probably relied too heavily on his size advantage. Collins was quicker but cocky, likely to make mistakes if he thought he had the upper hand. Reed was the weak link, nervous, unsure, and probably inexperienced in actual confrontation. The mess hall had emptied further during their confrontation. Only 2 tables remained occupied, both far enough away that the occupants couldn't hear the increasingly threatening conversation. The kitchen staff were busy with their closing duties, the clatter of dishes and running water masking any sounds from the dining area. The isolation was exactly what Morrison and his friends had been waiting for. "Let go of my arm," Sarah said quietly. Her tone still professional but with an undercurrent of steel that should have warned them they were making a serious mistake. Morrison laughed instead, interpreting her calm demeanor as fear or resignation. He tightened his grip even more, his fingers leaving marks on her skin that would be visible for days. "Or what?" he challenged, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "You'll report me? Tell them what exactly? That some soldiers wanted to be friendly with the help?" His confidence was absolute, built on previous incidents where his rank and connections had protected him from consequences. Collins and Reed chuckled at their leader's boldness, their own courage growing with the apparent success of their intimidation. Sarah's free hand remained relaxed at her side, but her muscles were coiling like springs beneath her deceptively casual posture. Years of training had taught her to appear helpless, right up until the moment she struck. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, even as adrenaline began flooding her system in preparation for what was about to happen. "One last time," she said softly, her dark eyes meeting Morrison's with unwavering directness. "Let me go." There was something in her voice now that caused Reed to shift uncomfortably, though he couldn't identify what had changed. Collins felt it too. A subtle shift in the atmosphere that made him suddenly uncertain about their plan. Morrison was too drunk and too arrogant to recognize the warning signs. Instead of releasing her, he decided to escalate further, reaching out with his free hand to touch her face in a gesture that crossed every line of appropriate behavior. "Make me," he whispered, his voice full of cruel anticipation. That was the moment Sarah Martinez stopped pretending to be a helpless civilian waitress. The transformation was instantaneous and shocking, like watching a house cat suddenly reveal itself as a tiger. Her entire demeanor changed in the space of a heartbeat, and the 3 soldiers found themselves facing something they had never encountered before and were completely unprepared to handle. The first 15 seconds were a masterclass in applied violence that left Morrison, Collins, and Reed completely unprepared for what hit them. Sarah's initial move was deceptively simple. A sharp twist of her captured wrist, combined with a pressure point strike that forced Morrison to release his grip while simultaneously sending shooting pain up his arm. Before he could react or even process what had happened, Her elbow connected with his solar plexus with surgical precision. Morrison doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his face turning an alarming shade of red as his diaphragm spasmed. The confident smirk disappeared from his face, replaced by shock and the dawning realization that he had severely misjudged the situation. Sarah moved like water flowing around obstacles, her body seeming to bend and shift in ways that made her impossible to grab or predict. Collins reacted first among the other two, lunging forward with his arms outstretched to tackle her from the side. His military training kicked in, but it was designed for conventional combat against other soldiers, not for dealing with someone who moved with the fluid efficiency of a Navy SEAL. Sarah dropped low beneath his grasping arms, her legs sweeping out to catch his ankle at precisely the right angle to send him crashing into a nearby table. The impact of Collins hitting the table sent plates and glasses flying in every direction, the crash finally alerting the distant diners and kitchen staff that something serious was happening in their section of the mess hall. But by the time they looked up from their conversations and duties, the confrontation was already shifting into its final phase, moving too quickly for anyone to intervene or even fully comprehend what they were witnessing. Reed hesitated for a crucial moment, torn between his desire to help his friends and his growing understanding that this was not going according to plan. That hesitation cost him dearly, as Sarah pivoted smoothly from her sweep of Collins to address the new threat. Her hand shot out in a quick jab that caught Reed just below his sternum. A precise strike that targeted nerve clusters and left him temporarily paralyzed with pain. Morrison was beginning to recover his breath and his rage, straightening up with murder in his eyes. He was bigger and stronger than she was, and his pride had been wounded in the worst possible way. All thoughts of restraint or proportional response fled from his mind as he charged forward like an enraged bull, intent on using his superior size and strength to overwhelm her through sheer brutality. Sarah sidestepped his charge with almost casual ease, using his own momentum against him in a redirect that sent him stumbling past her and into the wall behind. The impact was solid and jarring, but Morrison was tough and angry enough to shake it off quickly. He spun around, his fists raised and his face contorted with fury, ready to continue the fight regardless of the consequences. Collins was struggling to his feet among the wreckage of the table, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the edge during his fall. His coordination was still shaky, but his anger was building to match Morrison's. Reed remained bent over, clutching his chest and trying to force his muscles to respond properly. His participation in the fight effectively ended by Sarah's precise strike. The transformation in Sarah was complete now. Gone was any pretense of being a helpless civilian employee. Her stance was balanced and ready, her movements flowing with the deadly grace that came from years of the most intensive military training available. Her eyes were alert and calculating, tracking multiple threats simultaneously while maintaining perfect situational awareness of her environment. The remaining diners in the mess hall were beginning to realize that something extraordinary was happening. Some started moving toward the exits, unwilling to get involved in what appeared to be a serious altercation. Others pulled out their phones, instinctively recording what they were witnessing. A few called out toward the kitchen for security or help, their voices adding to the growing chaos of the situation. Morrison and Collins regrouped quickly, their military training finally kicking in as they began to work together more effectively. They spread out to flank her from different angles, forcing her to divide her attention between multiple attackers. Their approach was more cautious now, tempered by the painful lesson they had just received about underestimating their opponent. But they still had no idea who they were really fighting. Sarah Martinez wasn't just any Navy SEAL. She was part of an elite unit that specialized in operations requiring infiltration and deep cover. Her current assignment had brought her to this base for reasons that had nothing to do with serving food, and her cover identity as a waitress was just one layer of a much more complex operation. The next 20 seconds showcased exactly why Sarah Martinez had earned her place among the most elite warriors in the United States military. Morrison and Collins attacked simultaneously from opposite directions, their coordination improved but still woefully inadequate for dealing with someone of her caliber. Sarah read their intentions before they even began moving, her training allowing her to anticipate their strategy and prepare her counter-response. Morrison came in high with a powerful right hook aimed at her head, while Collins dropped low attempting to tackle her legs. It was a classic pincer movement, that would have overwhelmed most opponents, forcing them to choose which attack to defend against while leaving them vulnerable to the other. Sarah chose neither defense nor evasion. Instead, she went on the offensive in a way that turned their coordination against them. She leaped straight up, using Morrison's approaching shoulder as a stepping stone to vault over Collins entirely. Her boot connected with Morrison's face during her ascent, a perfectly timed strike that sent him reeling backward with a broken nose and streaming blood. Collins, committed to his low tackle, crashed into the spot where she had been standing and instead collided painfully with Morrison's legs. The two soldiers went down in a tangle of limbs and confusion, their careful coordination completely destroyed by Sarah's unexpected aerial maneuver. She landed gracefully behind them, already pivoting to face Reed, who had finally recovered enough to rejoin the fight. His approach was more cautious than his friend's, but caution wasn't going to save him from someone with Sarah's capabilities. Reed threw a series of quick jabs, his boxing training evident in his form and technique. Under normal circumstances, he was a competent fighter who could hold his own against most opponents. These were not normal circumstances. Sarah weaved between his punches like smoke, her movements so fluid and economical that she seemed to barely be trying. Her counterattack was swift and decisive, a combination of strikes that left Reed unconscious before he even realized he was falling. Morrison was back on his feet despite his broken nose, blood streaming down his face and fury burning in his eyes. All tactical thinking had left him now, replaced by pure rage and the desperate need to salvage his reputation and pride. He grabbed a chair from a nearby table, intending to use it as a weapon to overcome the reach and leverage disadvantage that conventional fighting had given him. Sarah assessed the new threat with professional detachment. A chair was a clumsy weapon in inexperienced hands, but it could still cause serious damage if it connected. Morrison was swinging it in wild, powerful arcs that spoke more of desperation than skill. She waited for the right moment, timing her move to coincide with his greatest vulnerability. The brief pause between swings when he was off balance and committed to his attack pattern. She moved inside his guard during that crucial moment, her hands gripping the chair and redirecting its momentum while simultaneously striking Morrison's wrist with enough force to make him release his grip. The chair flew across the room and crashed into a bank of windows, spiderwebbing the glass but not quite breaking through. Morrison staggered, clutching his injured wrist and finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Collins had disentangled himself from their earlier collision and was struggling to his feet, his head still ringing from various impacts, but his determination undiminished. He was the smartest of the three, and he was beginning to piece together the impossible truth about their opponent. No ordinary civilian could move like this, fight like this, or maintain such perfect control while dismantling trained soldiers with apparent ease. The mess hall had erupted into chaos by now. Kitchen staff were shouting for security and base police. The remaining diners were either fleeing toward the exits or pressing themselves against the walls to stay out of harm's way. Some were still recording with their phones, capturing footage that would later be studied and analyzed by military investigators trying to understand exactly what had happened. Sarah remained perfectly calm in the center of the storm, her breathing steady and controlled despite the intensive physical activity. She had barely broken a sweat during the confrontation, her superior conditioning and training making this feel more like a warm-up exercise than a serious fight. Her eyes continued to track all potential threats, while also monitoring the approaching sounds of security personnel responding to the commotion. Morrison made one last desperate attempt, charging forward with his remaining strength, and his good hand formed into a fist. His attack was slow and telegraphed, driven more by wounded pride than tactical sense. Sarah ended the confrontation with clinical efficiency, using a joint lock that sent Morrison to the ground and left him unable to continue fighting without risking serious injury to his shoulder and elbow. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. 3 soldiers who had entered the mess hall, confident in their ability to intimidate and overpower a civilian waitress, now lay defeated and demoralized on the dining room floor. Sarah stood among them, her uniform only slightly disheveled, looking for all the world like someone who had just finished a routine training exercise, rather than a 3-against-1 combat situation. The sound of heavy boots approaching rapidly through the corridors outside announced the imminent arrival of base security, military police, and quite possibly some very surprised commanding officers who were about to discover that their quiet little mess hall had just hosted a demonstration of combat skills that few people on the base could match. The final 10 seconds brought a revelation that would change everything for everyone involved in the incident. Base security personnel burst through the mess hall doors expecting to find a typical disciplinary situation. Perhaps some soldiers who had gotten too rowdy during dinner, or a minor altercation that had gotten out of hand. What they found instead was a scene that defied their understanding and challenged their assumptions about what they thought they knew. Morrison lay on the floor, clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of blood and confusion. Collins sat against an overturned table, holding his head and staring at Sarah with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. Reed remained unconscious, though he was beginning to stir slightly as the effects of her precise strike wore off. All three bore the unmistakable marks of having been systematically and professionally defeated by someone who clearly possessed training far beyond anything they had encountered. Sergeant Williams led the security team through the entrance, his hand resting on his sidearm and his eyes quickly scanning the room to assess the situation. He had been expecting to separate some drunk soldiers and file routine reports about minor misconduct. Instead, he found himself looking at what appeared to be the aftermath of a one-sided combat demonstration that had left 3 of his personnel thoroughly beaten by a mess hall employee. Sarah straightened her apron and smoothed back her hair with practiced efficiency, her transformation back to the role of quiet civilian staff member almost as startling as her earlier revelation of combat prowess. To the arriving security team, she appeared to be exactly what she was supposed to be. A slightly shaken food service worker who had somehow been involved in an altercation with soldiers who clearly got the worst of whatever had happened. "What the hell happened here?" Sergeant Williams demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to getting immediate answers. His eyes moved between Sarah and the 3 defeated soldiers, trying to piece together a sequence of events that made sense. The physical evidence suggested a level of violence and skill that seemed impossible given the apparent participants. Morrison struggled to speak through his broken nose and injured pride, his words coming out as a pained mumble that was barely coherent. She's not. That's not possible." His attempt to explain what had happened only served to make him sound delusional, or possibly concussed. The security team exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to question whether alcohol or drugs might be involved in the soldier's condition. Collins managed to speak more clearly, though his words were equally unbelievable to the listening security personnel. "She destroyed us," he said simply, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and shame. "We thought she was just a waitress, but she moved like nothing I've ever seen. She took all 3 of us apart like we were children playing soldier." The security team's skepticism was obvious and understandable. The idea that a small female civilian employee could single-handedly defeat 3 trained military personnel was so far outside their experience that they were more inclined to believe the soldiers were making excuses for some embarrassing defeat they had suffered among themselves. Drug tests and alcohol screenings were clearly going to be necessary to get to the bottom of this incident. Sarah maintained her cover perfectly, playing the role of a frightened civilian who had been caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, a performance so convincing that even experienced military personnel found themselves protective of her apparent vulnerability. "They grabbed me and wouldn't let go," she said softly. "I just tried to get away, and they started fighting each other." The story she offered was plausible enough to explain the soldier's injuries while maintaining her cover identity. Friendly fire incidents weren't uncommon when alcohol was involved, and the security team was already leaning toward an explanation that involved the 3 soldiers injuring each other during a drunken altercation that somehow involved harassment of civilian staff. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes arrived moments later, drawn by reports of a significant incident in the mess hall. His presence elevated the situation from a routine security matter to something that would require formal investigation and documentation. Hayes was known for his attention to detail and his intolerance for misconduct, particularly behavior that involved civilian personnel or brought discredit to the unit. As Hayes surveyed the scene, his experienced eye noted details that the security team had missed. The positioning of the injured soldiers, the pattern of their injuries, and the complete absence of any signs that Sarah had been involved in physical confrontation didn't match the story that was beginning to emerge. Something about the entire situation felt staged or incomplete, As if crucial information was being withheld, the three soldiers were helped to their feet and prepared for transport to the medical facility for treatment and evaluation. Their injuries were significant but not life-threatening, suggesting that whoever had inflicted them possessed both considerable skill and remarkable restraint. Morrison's broken nose and shoulder injury, Collins's concussion, and Reed's precise nerve strike all bore the hallmarks of professional combat training, applied with surgical precision. As the security team prepared to escort the soldiers away, Morrison made one last attempt to tell the truth about what had happened. His words were clearer now, despite his injuries, and his tone carried the weight of someone trying desperately to be believed. "That woman is not who she pretends to be," he said, pointing at Sarah with his uninjured arm. "She's military, special forces, something like that. No civilian fights like that." The security team recorded his statement dutifully, but their expressions made it clear they considered it the desperate fabrication of someone trying to avoid responsibility for his actions. The idea that a Navy SEAL was working undercover as mess hall staff was so far beyond their security clearance and operational awareness that it simply didn't register as a possibility they needed to consider seriously. 24 hours later, the reverberations from the mess hall incident were still spreading through the base command structure like ripples in a pond. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had spent most of the previous night reviewing security footage, witness statements, and medical reports that painted an increasingly puzzling picture of what had actually occurred. The injuries sustained by Morrison, Collins, and Reed were consistent with professional combat techniques, not the random violence of a drunken brawl. The medical examination had revealed additional details that troubled Hayes and his investigating team. Morrison's broken nose showed evidence of a precise upward strike rather than a wild punch. Collins' concussion displayed impact patterns, suggesting a controlled fall rather than an accidental collision. Reed's temporary paralysis had been caused by pressure applied to specific nerve clusters that required anatomical knowledge most civilians simply didn't possess. Meanwhile, Sarah Martinez continued her duties in the mess hall, as if nothing had happened, serving meals with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her work for months. Her behavior was entirely consistent with someone who had witnessed a disturbing incident but wasn't directly involved in the violence. The kitchen staff and other dining room employees spoke highly of her professionalism and work ethic, describing her as reliable and unremarkable. Captain Rodriguez from the base intelligence office had been quietly conducting his own investigation, parallel to the official security review. His interest had been piqued not by the incident itself, but by inconsistencies in Sarah's background check that had somehow been overlooked during her initial employment screening. Her references checked out, her documentation appeared legitimate, but something about her entire profile felt too perfect, too carefully constructed. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez ran Sarah's fingerprints through military databases that went far beyond the standard civilian employment screening. The results that came back were classified at levels that required him to immediately contact his superior officers and request a secure communication channel with Naval Special Warfare Command. Sarah Martinez was not just any Navy SEAL. She was part of an elite counterintelligence unit conducting a highly classified operation on the base. The real purpose of her assignment was far more serious than anyone had imagined. Intelligence agencies had received credible information about potential security breaches involving classified weapons technology being developed at the facility. Sarah's mission was to identify the source of these leaks by establishing herself in a position where she could observe personnel interactions and identify suspicious behavior patterns among base staff and military personnel. Her cover as a mess hall employee was perfect for the assignment, providing her with access to informal conversations and off-duty behavior that might reveal security violations or compromised personnel. The dining facility was a natural gathering place where people relaxed their guard and spoke more freely than they would in formal military settings. Over 3 months of careful observation, she had been building a comprehensive profile of potential security risks. The confrontation with Morrison and his friends had threatened to blow her cover at a crucial moment in the investigation. She had been forced to choose between maintaining her civilian identity and protecting herself from a dangerous situation that was escalating beyond harassment into potential assault. Her training and instincts had taken over, revealing capabilities that were inconsistent with her cover story. When Captain Rodriguez finally approached her directly, Sarah knew immediately that her operational security had been compromised. The conversation took place in a secure room away from the mess hall, with proper authentication protocols and classified communication procedures. Rodriguez explained that her cover was partially blown, but that the mission could potentially continue if they could contain the damage from the previous night's incident. The three soldiers who had attacked her presented a unique challenge. Morrison, Collins, and Reed were now convinced that she was military personnel. But their credibility was damaged by their own misconduct and the circumstances surrounding their injuries. Their commanding officers were already predisposed to dismiss their claims as desperate attempts to avoid responsibility for harassing civilian staff. Sarah provided Rodriguez with a detailed after-action report that documented not only the physical confrontation, but also her observations about the security concerns that had prompted her mission. She had identified several personnel with access to sensitive areas who displayed behavioral patterns consistent with potential compromise. Her investigation was approaching a critical phase where actionable intelligence was beginning to emerge. The decision was made at levels far above the base command structure. Sarah's cover would be maintained through careful management of the investigation and strategic misdirection of the inquiry into the mess hall incident. The three soldiers would face disciplinary action for their misconduct, and their claims about Sarah's identity would be dismissed as unfounded allegations designed to deflect responsibility for their behavior. 6 weeks later, Sarah Martinez quietly completed her assignment and disappeared from the base as unremarkably as she had arrived. Her final report led to the identification and arrest of a procurement officer who had been selling classified technical specifications to foreign intelligence agents. The security breach was closed, the investigation was classified, and life on the base returned to normal. Morrison, Collins, and Reed never learned the truth about the woman they had cornered in the mess hall. They served their disciplinary sentences and were eventually transferred to other units, carrying with them the knowledge that they had encountered something extraordinary that night. Something their superiors would never believe, and something they themselves would never fully understand. The 45 seconds that changed their understanding of strength, skill, and the dangers of